Yeah, hello everybody. I like to welcome you to the third day of the International BMBF Network Conference. I think it's a very interesting and important event, and I'm very honored to chair this event today.
Recording in
let
progress.
me all welcome you. I will say a bit more about our speakers later on. I'd also like to welcome the directors of the Maria Sibylla Merian Center, the CALAS professor, and then I will also introduce them in more detail. I'd also like to welcome the representatives of the DLR and the BMBF and of all the other institutions of the BMBF who are listening, and of course all other listeners on all the channels available. We are very happy that you are here with us. We will have the discussion and the dialogue in English, but you find, if you want to or prefer to follow the discussion in Spanish, you will find something to do. At the right, there is a small button where you can also choose the Spanish version. It will be translated directly. We will first now have inputs for 20 minutes, and at the end, there will be a discussion, all three papers together. And if you want, so you see the technical things first, if you have a question, please raise your hand or put a commentary in the chat, then we can give it, make it open. Yeah, as I said, I really like this idea about an interregional, intercultural dialogue as this network is. And it's very important that we talk to each other. We don't do that enough. Moreover, even more, the global south and the global north is not enough talking with each other. And I think this is a format here where it's that is very important for all of us. And it's not only that we talk with each other, but as also you explained in the abstract to this event, the questioning of the global north and its knowledge systems is very important. And so I'm looking forward very much to our discussions today. So let me at first introduce our speakers. We will start with Professor Dr. Martin Fuchs, who is at the Maria Sibylla Merian Tagore Center in Delhi, and who's also at the in Erfurt at Erfurt University. He is a trained sociologist and anthropologist and professor for Indian religion. His work is very inspiring, and I could now talk a lot about that, but I don't want to take the time of your papers and want to stress that I most of all really are inspired and was intrigued by your work about cultural translation or translation in the intercultural, transcultural context. Second speaker will be Professor Dr. Alexandra Cuffel, who is Professor for Jewish Religion in Past and Present Times at the Center for Religious Studies at the Ruhr University of Bochum. And in Bochum, this religious studies is a very dynamic center for these topics in Germany. But Alexandra, if I look at your vita, I think Bochum is very happy to got you when I see where all the places you've been before. So congratulations also to Bochum for that. You work mostly about Jewish, Christian and Muslims during the Middle Ages, and I am quite intrigued and was intrigued and inspired by your work about this racial attitude, or if we can talk about racial attitudes in the Middle Ages, and I'm looking forward to the book which will come soon. And our third, last but not least speaker, Professor Dr. Werner Gephart from the Center of Advanced Study in Humanities, Law is Culture at Bonn. He is a legal scholar, a sociologist, and an artist, which is very interdisciplinary, I think much more than many of us are. I could also talk now a lot about where you all have been in Washington, in Israel, at Science Po, and this context of law as culture, I think it is very important for all of us, because law and history, law and the humanities are often not as connected as they should be, as I also know from my work. And so I'm really very happy that we have in this group also somebody from law. So with this, I give you the floor. Martin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Antje Flüchter, for the introduction. I just go into medias res. Huh? Dialogue is that magic term that we employ whenever we think of how we can deal with differences of opinion or conflicts over important issues. Entering or even organizing a dialogue is meant to reduce disagreements, to overcome misunderstandings, and to provide access to a world of meaning that the interlocutors of the other side are not familiar with. Dialogue connotes an ideal. At the same time, the term is being used to depict the various exchanges and conversations that one can observe in the actual world, which do not necessarily conform to the ideal. Dialogues refer to a particular Sprachspiel, a live modality, in which two or more sides engage with each other by exchanging arguments and, ideally, by listening to each other. The aims of such endeavor may be conceived in diverse ways, however. The absolute ideal would be that all sides involved learn from their others, change their own views, or even amend the assumptions underlying their own positions. At the same time, dialogue is often meant to pull others over to one's side, to convince others of one's position, and thus to make one's own position prevail. The third possibility is that of an agonal dispute, in which no side wins. In such case, not only may viewpoints and statements of fact be under dispute, the dispute may also be, openly or implicitly, about the very form in which a conversation is conducted, and thus about the question who defines the format of the dialogue. Interculturality, the other enticing and much invoked term, is even more fraught with difficulties. Again, we partly deal with an ideal. The ideal evinced is that of the crossing of boundaries, cultural boundaries, boundaries between cultures, an ideal of reciprocally gaining acquaintance with worldviews and the life of others who assumedly belong to another culture. There is a problem, however, regarding the underlying concept, the concept of culture. The image evoked is that of bounded worlds of signification and practice, and of entrenched incongruences and discrepancies between these worlds. The inherent vision is one of cultural worlds as baskets, each of which containing elements and traits that differ from those contained in the other baskets. Moreover, this image places humans within these containers, as if each person or subject or self would belong to or into one cultural world and one world only. Looked at from the inside, each of these containers is supposed to be characterized by similarities, sameness, even uniformity among its members, and equally uniformity of the practices and worldviews as supposedly governing one such cultural world. Moreover, we also have to consider the prefix inter more closely. The prefix catches the ambivalence of relations between cultural worlds. Inter means to connect two or more entities, be these places, things, or groups of people. Inter thus suggests an interrelation, a Wechselbeziehung in German, and thus underlines the separateness of the entities that are connected. In the hands of some authors, this is being expanded further. Inter can also carry the meaning of in between or zwischen in German. And this has been developed into the notion of a third space, in between the two or more original spaces. The idea behind this interpretation is that it requires a special awareness or knowledge to be able to enter such third space. Applied to the relation between cultures, the second connotation of inter thus emphasizes the idea of distinctness and boundedness of the different worlds of signification even further. In my view, then, the very term interculturality rather denotes the problem we are facing and not the solution or answer. Simply put, the modern process of first economic and then cultural and political globalization, understood here in a broad sense, that is the process of interconnecting more and more people, and this way more and more forms of life, appears as a development that was accompanied by developments which raised the symbolic as well as intellectual boundaries between people. Since early modernity, the language of containers was introduced and spread step by step. The process of connecting to the wider world was accompanied by an urge to rule and in that context, an urge to distance oneself from others. This started with the invention of religions as containers, each subsuming a section of the world's population, followed by the invention of the idea of nations, aiming at conformity within and clear-cut boundaries towards the outside. Partly building on these developments, the next step was the invention of the notion of cultures in the plural and as isolates and wholes, which generated the problem of cultural relativism. Similarly, the idea of bounded societies that has widely governed sociology until these days built on the image of nation states. For this, the label of methodological nationalism was coined. And we find similar attitudes in the form of the inflationary use of the notion of community. Communities vying for self-determination and insisting on their particularities. Community today is an ethic as it is an emic term, and a term that is particularly vague. These different containers serve both as boxes for institutional and governance arrangements and as terms for cultural as well as scholarly representation. This concerns the way both one's own context and that of one's so-called others have been depicted and classified. All these containers and terms of representation were particularly pushed by Western political and social actors and by Western thinkers. And they were so successful that today this mode of thinking defines the very arena within which we not only interact globally, meet with each other, but within which also the critique of Western political and epistemic dominance is being articulated. These container concepts govern the language we use today to relate to one another, and these concepts inform comparisons undertaken among cultural regions and even civilizations. What is more, these concepts have been translated into operational practices. They have been institutionalized in public as well as academic discourses, within which all sides, proponents as well as critics, are confined, or if trying to unravel these epistemic convolutions, which critics too cannot escape grappling with and have to fight against. Thus, even well-intentioned calls for intercultural dialogue run the danger of just confirming the container model. The immediate reaction of non-Westerners to how their non-Western social and cultural worlds have been represented by outside experts, or they have been orientalized, to use a catchphrase, have been attempts to claim the position of representation for oneself. Again, instead of being othered, the claim then often made is to speak on behalf of a whole group, if not a whole society, culture, a religious tradition, or even a whole civilization. The attempt to assume the position of a culture's spokesperson. What this politically means can be observed every day in all parts of the world. But it has also affected scholarly discourses in a big way in the shape of identity discourses. Dialogue on such background is thus often nothing more than an exchange of simplistic and stereotypical claims about what each side considers their own culture, and likewise the stereotypes each side holds regarding its respective others. Is this then not just a caricature of intercultural dialogue? What I sketched very crudely so far needs two qualifications. First and importantly, and this has to be pointed out at the start to be able to develop the following thoughts, the secular trend depicted denotes the overall trend. Fortunately, thinking in terms of boxes or containers never completely excluded other ways of relating to other people, at least on the intersubjective level. Some of these other ways I will make use of in the following. Secondly, I leave the question open whether the image of cultural containers or baskets into which everyone belongs is just the product of modern colonial globalization, or whether this tendency was already inscribed into the concept of clearly bounded religions, and thus cultural worldviews, that have governed the Abrahamic or Semitic tradition, and or whether it goes back to the forms of vernacularization in Europe in the second millennium that grew out of the coercive Latin cosmopolitanism established under the Roman Empire. Both pre-modern Asian religions and South Asian vernacularization following on the more voluntaristic Sanskrit cosmopolitanism represented other modes of engaging with differences, as expounded by Sheldon Pollock. This is just one, though prominent example of an alternative, but it resulted in other forms of interculturality. Expressed differently, thinking in terms of cultural containers when addressing cultural differences is not the natural mode of thinking, as some Western authors claim. There have always been other options, and it is these which could be important resources we can build on when developing intercultural dialogues. Dialogue, in a genuine sense, requires or must lead towards attempts at understanding. The guiding idea thus cannot be one of organizing dialogues between cultures or between representatives of different cultures. Attempts at understanding must relate to specific questions and issues. It makes no sense to try to understand cultural entities at large, or even try to convey the alleged essence of a culture. We need a different conceptualization, a new understanding of the very ground on which intercultural exchange happens. For reasons that will become clear in the following, I suggest a terminological shift from intercultural to intercontextual. In my following remarks, I will distinguish between modes of cultural and social coexistence, coexistence with and across differences, and the pragmatic epistemic question of intercontextual interaction. To take the second point first, let me present in a nutshell assumptions underlying my position. In each context, as laid out, there is always more than one voice. At the same time, no one belongs to one context only. Rather, social actors are connected to multiple contexts to a smaller or larger degree. People interconnect different contexts in their daily life, practically as well as mentally. In many situations and constellations, various different reference frames or idioms or discourses associated with often different epistemes meet and intersect, of course not free of tensions. Social-cultural worlds represent ranges of registers, integrated units, functional spheres or systems, as well as reference frames. Actors are capable to connect to several registers, functional spheres, as well as several reference frames. That is, are able to translate or move between the different spheres, registers, and frames. Social actors can even wholeheartedly enter and inhabit several frames concurrently. By the same token, reference frames can extend and have relevance beyond elite social and cultural boundaries. Reference frames are adapted and appropriated in various ways locally and situationally. The modes of relating to others and other cultural schemas, and this brings me to my second point, can be and actually are different. Ways of relating to others and to other positionalities, viewpoints, and reference frames have been established in each social and cultural context. The modalities and scenarios of relating to cultural differences, however, vary. What is more, in more cases than not, in more cases than thinkers had assumed until lately, many regions and contexts, in fact, represent zones of entanglement, Verschränkungszonen, of disparate frames of reference of widely differing origins. The positionality of someone trying to initiate dialogues across differences and boundaries is thus in certain respects shared with the positionalities of many others who, like them, live in such zones of entanglement. Turning hermeneutical, we have to start from the realization that we are already interrelated when dialogue starts. Intercultural dialogue not only aims at establishing relatedness, intercultural dialogue assumes relatedness. the relatedness of life worlds and life forms, no matter whether these relations have been politically or economically established. All these interrelations represent forms of participation and intervention. Any attempt at dialogue occurs therefore within the spaces of overlap of cultural worlds and of reciprocal interpenetration of cultural worlds, within which and within which one interacts. Each partner to a dialogue intervenes and participates in the other context in the very act of interpretation and interaction. Most clearly, this applies to texts, the classical arena of hermeneutics, as well as to oral exchanges, but obviously also to practices and modalities of joint living or joint research. To rephrase what I want to point to, what is assumed here is the acknowledgement of interrelations and entanglements. This is very different from representations of foreign contexts, foreign in quotation marks, as contexts removed from one's own, in cases when the connection to the other contexts has been completely cut. Such stance had been the starting point of cultural theories that blank out anthropological experience, like in the case of Hegel's depiction of Africa and Asia, or partly with cultural relativism. But such stance is also deeply ingrained in methodological individualism and methodological nationalism. It would be meaningful to take a closer look at the culturally different kinds of intercultural interconnections and interrelations of social actors and intellectual interpreters, as well as frames of reference, that is, the different modes of coexistence with and across differences. The advantage of the contemporary purely cosmopolitan world is that we are in a position where we have the chance and the possibility to become familiar with a wider range of relational options than ever before, and may perhaps be able to learn from some of the options. Let me briefly mention a few of these options. Working in South Asia, one encounters various constellations of cultural diversity and plurality that are non-exclusionary. One finds elaborate forms of open pluralistic entanglement of different traditions, reaching from overlapping to continuous interaction and exchanges between traditions, from respect for other cultural or religious pathways to ideas of choice between alternatives that elsewhere would not be deemed permissible. And there are the modalities of inclusivism, in which options different from one's own, preferred one, are being encompassed as forms of lesser truths, that is, accepted as of less value, but not to be eliminated. All these options differ from notions of tolerance that acknowledge other positions while remaining disinterested and keeping a distance. At the same time, and concurrently with the forms mentioned, one equally finds in India strong forms of disavowal of certain others in other traditions who are not accepted as equal, a refusal of dialogue, understanding, translation, and even interaction. The forms of porous plurality mentioned allowed until recently to sustain a degree of cultural and religious plurality, intellectual openness, and freedom of interaction, while excluding stigmatized sections of people, that contrasts sharply with the ways of relating to others that so far have been dominant in the West. Getting closer to the level of intersubjective experience, contemporary experiences which at least some Westerners have also shared that concern practices of living with differences, anthropologists in particular have started developing and elaborating several modes of interrelationality. These include various forms of transculturation, a term meant to refer to experiences of being permeated by several cultural traditions and influences, of participating in more than one cultural world, relating to each in specific ways, which reach from accommodation and adaptation to resistance, rejection, or parody. Another mode is that of nomadic thinking, taken from Deleuze and Guattari, that does not separate differences into oppositional dualities, conceives subjectivity free from the confines of identity, and creates a dialogue based on becoming, on dynamic interactions. A third to be mentioned is what some call double consciousness or biculturality, that is, being anchored in two contexts and having something like a multiple identity. If nothing else, looking closer at the various forms of interaction across cultural differences gives at least an idea of what is possible in arenas of interculturality and what is already available. How different frames of reference relate, interact, qualify, thwart, and interpenetrate each other is intercultural exchange in a wider sense. The observations about intercontextuality and interculturality also allow to throw new light on the question of translation, which is not the focus of discussion here. Intellectuals and scholars have to reinsert themselves and their debates on cross-boundary dialogue into the fields and arrangements of interrelation and coexistence across differences, which these debates at the end derive their impetus from. If the intention is not to subsume others and their modes of thought under our categories and for our purposes, which means to misrepresent them, if our intention is to listen to others and discover new dimensions, if our intention is to develop successful forms of cultural exchange across differences, we have to start from the very forms and modes of interrelation evolved and practiced in different cultural contexts by historical as well as contemporary actors. Among these, thinkers and theorists are just one, even if particularly relevant, group. The approach to interculturality suggested here is thus one that starts from the relations between the sides and the people involved, from intersubjective and interpersonal experiences, and not from reified ideas of cultural containers. Intercultural dialogue can only happen on the level of interactions between and among subjects, and between and among the reference frames that are invoked in these encounters and that intersect and interconnect. We have to replace intercultural confrontation with intercultural hermeneutics. Or better perhaps, we have to develop the social hermeneutics in which a dialogue worth the term can develop, a dialogue at least that moves closer to the ideal of a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go directly to Alexandra Cuffel. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much for having me. And let me begin. So when studying intercultural or specifically interreligious relations in my own time period of specialization, the so-called Middle Ages, the tendency has been to focus on the production and impact of written and visual sources which directly address the religious or cultural other in some way. These consist of polemic, legal literature, literary representations such as those in romances, travel narratives, hagiography, or even chronicles or illumination of manuscripts, frescoes, and sculptures, to name but a few examples. Other scholars have focused on encounters resulting from daily proximity, such as the impact of Jewish and Christian children playing together, or their mothers exchanging information about medicines, spells, or lullabies. Today, I would like to explore the relationship between incidental encounters and more directed, explicit attempts at regulating cross-cultural exchanges. I will show that the two were, and I would suggest still are, closely intertwined, and too often the knowledge of the religio-cultural other acquired through oral exchanges and other forms of culturally specific sensory input are overlooked. Certainly, religious and community leaders were anxious about precisely such encounters. In Northern Europe, for example, Jewish men were warned, whoever has a small son and lays him in a cradle in order that he not cry, he should not sing for him the songs and hymns of the Gentiles, non-Jews. A man should not play a pleasant hymn in front of a Christian priest, lest the priest use the same tune for his foreign worship. Here in this passage, it is taken as a matter of course that Jewish men would know both religious and non-religious songs of Christians well enough to be able to sing them to their children. The mode of transmission of such musical knowledge could come from simple overhearing, as implied in the second half of the citation, in which Jews are warned not to play their religious songs in earshot of a Christian priest, lest he appropriate the tunes of his own for his own religious services. Other texts describe a more directed, intentional exchange, as, for example, a 15th century contract from Avignon, which stipulates the conditions in which a Christian man, Antonius, would pay a Jew for teaching him songs. He is only to pay for the songs he has learned, and the Jew promises to teach the songs faithfully and without deceit and fraud, even as Antonius agreed to work hard at learning them, also without fraud. While this source presents a case of very intentional cross-cultural musical exchange, one must ask how Antonius first heard enough, presumably Jewish songs, to seek out instruction in them. We return again to accidental overhearing. Note too that both this contract and the Jewish moralizing text, Book of the Pious, cited earlier, present members of the religious and cultural majority as overhearing and seeking to learn the music of a minority community. While it might be expected to or assume that members of a minority would overhear and adopt elements of the majority culture which surrounds them, as in the case of the Jewish father singing Christian songs to his son, these texts remind us that this process goes in both directions. Anxiety about the religious sounds of a minority community are regularly expressed in medieval legal literature, both by European Christians, as they prohibited the sounding of the Muslim call to prayer or insist that Jews not pray loudly in their synagogues, and by Muslims in their own lands, who prohibited loud church clappers or chanting in churches, synagogues, or processions. Such regulations constitute the exertion of power of the ruling religio-cultural majority, or members of them, over minorities, whether in the past or in modern times. They also point to the underlying fear of the power of casual, accidental hearing of the sounds of the religious or cultural other. Church bells or the call to prayer were and are loud, public, and symbolically weighted for the entire community. The exchanges between Antonius and his Jewish music teacher, or the anonymous Jews and Christian priest in the Book of the Pious, are examples of the progression of casual overhearing of the sound of a religious cultural minority by members of the majority to intentionally seeking. Muslim writers from the 12th to the 15th century CE complained of similar problems. Ibn Taymiyyah, the 13th century Hanbali jurist from Syria, complained when describing Christian practices regarding lighting incense for the dead and against unfriendly spirits. And here I quote, "And they recite incantations with it, the burning of incense to the beat of small copper knockers and special words. They hang crosses on doors of their houses and do similar other disreputable things. However, I mention what I recalled of it because I saw many Muslims do it, and its origin was taken from them, i.e. the Christians, when on this Thursday the markets remained filled with the sounds of these tiny knockers and with the words of incantations by astrologers, and other than these words, nothing is more useless. It is what is unlawful or unbelief." Here, sound is a major component of inescapable religious encounter. Incantation and copper knockers fill the market, but it is not the only one. Smell in the form of incense and visual symbols, the hanging of crosses on doors, impose themselves upon Ibn Taymiyyah and any other Muslim or Jew going through the market. Surrounded by all of these, some Muslims actively adopted these practices as well, much to Ibn Taymiyyah's distress. Al-Turtushi, from Muslim Spain lamented that Muslims came out to watch Christian holiday celebrations, dressed up their children, and delighted in special holiday foods such as donuts, which Muslims not only enjoyed during Christian festivity, but reproduced for their own holidays. For authors such as Al-Tutushi and Ibn Taymiyyah, such appropriation of Christian customs, even when not directly tied to religious meaning, implied approval of Christians and blurred the distinction between communities. Here again, we see the movement from passive observation to active appropriation. Furthermore, these Muslim authors were well aware of the power of observation, mimicry, and shared foodways, clothing, and other visual indicators and sound to create a bridge between communities, which in turn could lead to much deeper shifts and sharing at the level of religious practice, belief, and cosmological outlook. Those who created sensory cues were well aware of their power to affect those within and outside their own communities. Scholars of Syriac liturgical practice have demonstrated that hymns sung within and outside churches, and both men and women's monasteries, were designed to instruct. When one considers this in light of extensive descriptions in Muslim and Christian sources of Muslims visiting monasteries, being enthralled by the music there, observing processions, and enjoying the hospitalities of monasteries, allusions to the temptation of conversion or religious misbehavior in Muslim sources take on new meanings. While the main intended audience of such Christian visual and auditory displays would have been primarily other Christians, accounts in Christian hagiographies and chronicles about Muslims being moved to donate money and other precious items or grant privileges to them, a practice also attested in Christian and Muslim legal sources, indicate that Christians were aware of the attraction that monasteries, churches, and their accompanying visual and auditory display held for the religious majority. Christian leaders were happy to reap the benefits of this attraction and seemingly encouraged it. In Western Europe, both inside and outside of churches, moralizing animal lore, which was articulated in sermons, tales, and bestiaries, were frequently displayed. Written and visual productions by Jews in medieval Europe clearly show that Jews were well aware of the tales and symbolic meanings attributed to these animals by Christians and reformulated them according to their own needs. In part, such knowledge of Christian visual culture would have been gained by casual viewing as Jews passed the church or cathedral. Jewish neighborhoods were frequently located close to the main church. But Christian authorities also often insisted that Jews watch civic and religious processions, which would have necessitated gathering around the square in which a cathedral was located. Royal entries and religious processions in Iberia especially frequently required the participation of Jews and Muslims, though Muslims and Jews also competed with one another for a place in such celebrations because of the prestige associated with them. When no more Jews and Muslims were available, their converted descendants or old Christians also adopted their attire and presented the music and games associated with these communities. They also had to act out Christian defeat of Muslims in war or ritual humiliation of Jews. Christian rulers, civic and religious authorities used the lure of pageantry with its combined visual, auditory, and even gustatory sensory input to convey messages both to those who participated, whether willingly or not, and those who watched. Yet, as scholars who have examined this phenomenon have shown, participation by members of religious minorities was not always forced, which is a testament to how strong the attraction of these kinds of events had. But it was not simply a case of the majority, in this case Christian, imposing their religious and cultural messages, drawing on the power of visual splendor, music, games, and special foods. They adopted or imitated the music, dress, and games of religious minorities so that these became an integral part of Christian celebration. While Christians may have reshaped these to suit their own purposes, much as Jews retooled Christian animal symbolism, both examples point to an entangled interplay between the symbol and customs of religious minority and majority culture, which move from incidental seeing and hearing to directed appropriation. Now, I would like to turn to indications of links between formal polemic and incidental religious encounters. Within the Middle East, it is becoming increasingly clear that differing language and alphabet were not the barriers scholars once assumed. Jews collected Christian and Muslim texts of all kinds, including religious, not only in Arabic, but also more rarely in Syriac and Coptic. These included liturgical works and polemic, in addition to tales, philosophy, and mystical treatises. We even have a word list for Judeo-Arabic equivalents to Armenian words. Christians and Jews exchanged ideas about biblical translation and interpretation. Individual members of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities were not only familiar with one another's scriptural and exegetical traditions, but also actively sought out and helped outsiders to understand extra-scriptural religious texts. References to Jewish liturgy shows up in Christian anti-Jewish polemic. The writings of the Muslim legalist and student of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, indicate that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah was curious enough about the Talmud to ask a Jew to translate or summarize parts of it for him, which he then used in his discussion of Jewish practice and anti-Christian polemic. He also referred to what Christians and Jews said about one another. One may argue that this would refer to written polemic, in which Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah was clearly interested. I would suggest that such references refer to Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's knowledge of Christian Jewish oral exchanges and encounters. We have occasional references to exchanges of religious insults between Jews and Christians in the Cairo Geniza on an oral level. The Cairo Geniza is a repository of discarded Jewish texts, or texts discarded by Jews, I should say, found in Cairo, dating mostly from the 11th to the 19th centuries. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's offhand descriptions of the tales and insults Christians and Jews exchange, and his own employment of a Jew to help them study parts of the Talmud, point to the importance of oral exchanges and their possible impact on more explicit written representations of interreligious or cross-cultural encounters. Likewise, increasing evidence of conversion between Judaism and Christianity in both directions in the Middle East during the later Middle Ages points to the power of such encounters. While the examination of interreligious or cross-cultural encounter in the modern world encompasses digital media, music, signs, television, and movies, all modern forms of more casual exchange than the formal dialogue or debate, such forms are no less vital in their pre-modern equivalents for our understanding of interreligious and cross-cultural encounter. These must be studied together with more explicit formal expressions of differentiation if we are to truly understand interreligious and cross-cultural encounters of the past. Very often doing so underscores a discrepancy between the representation by community leaders who saw their job to create community boundaries and the lived practices and interactions of multifarious communities of pre-modern Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Europe and the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going directly to the legal field. Werner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my PowerPoint presentation. I hope it will work. Once again, excuse me, I come here very soon. And can you see Can you see this PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Aber
Good.
noch nicht die Bildschirmpräsentation. It's still.
Okay, so I have here something to do in order to bring about this Bildschirm presentation. I don't know exactly at the very moment where to do this.
No, I think you go. I think go back to the with the file. Sorry.
Yes. Okay. And then
there is this one Reiter Bildschirmpräsentation. I would.
Ja, der ist bei mir dummerweise überlagert. Da liegt
okay.
irgendwie was drüber.
Bei mir steht da noch mal extra so. Ja, jetzt auch weg. Und Ansicht, auf Ansicht gehen?
Ansicht ist auch was Schönes. Tut mir leid, ich habe hier jetzt wirklich ein kleines Problem.
Und
sonst
einfach
weiter, sonst unten auf der Leiste, neben den Minus- und dem Pluszeichen, da ist dieses kleine Feld, das Icon mit dem, ja, das daneben, links daneben das Icon.
Ja, genau.
Jetzt rechts daneben,
nee, rechts.
Das andere rechts daneben.
Was so aussieht wie Hinterziehen.
Ja, das genau.
Ja, perfekt. Jetzt ist alles gut.
Ach, das ist doch schön, wenn man sieht, dass man in diesen Dingen nicht ganz alleine ist. Und so thank you very much indeed, and especially to the two persons who spoke first. My question to Alexandra Cuffel would be, is there a kind of normative background, normative framing that makes interaction, religious interaction possible, as we had it, for example, in Andalusia in the model of convivencia, though there had been a lot of telling about violence elements by Nuremberg and others about this kind of interaction, but the normative framing would be very interesting for me. And this is linked to the question whether cultures of interculturality, as it was mentioned by Martin Fuchs, may be important in this context. And so a link between religious interpretations of the world and the normativity that is brought in by law may be alluded to. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be with you and to have the occasion to have a dialogue, a discussion with you, as I hope. Law is associated with authority, conflict resolution, the distinction between right and wrong, an institutional no-sayer, and much less seen as a medium of dialogue or of communication. That is why, by the way, that I think Habermas had such a lot of problems to integrate law into his model of his theory of communicative action. What then a Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities that has chosen to analyze law as culture may contribute to the problem of intercultural dialogue. I would like to develop this idea in 3 steps, starting with some theoretical reflections about the role of law in intercultural dialogue. Secondly, taking advantage of the immense normative laboratorium we live in, pandemic times, by the way, to present some examples from South America and Asia to the Maghrebinian world and old Europe in order to present the all-embracing theoretical figure of a pandemic validity culture, allowing to communicate between different legal cultures that had to deal with new expectations toward the law, namely to heal society. But this is my program, and I come to the first point. It took a while to understand that law is not just a normative order, bringing order into the chaos of normative expectations. It is true that conflict resolution, predictability, and stability in contingent social interactions is one of the main purposes of the law. But its latent functions, as Robert K. Merton might have formulated it, lie also in formulating the collective identity of a respective social system. This is true through the though less explicit, for French law, where the Code Napoleon plays an important role in the self-conception of the nation, whereas the German code, civil code, the BGB, would certainly much less be regarded as an identity marker of German traditions. When you would ask the everyday life perception in the street. On the other hand, migration processes let migrate not only food and fashion, but also normative cultures. That is why people from the Islamic world had not only couscous in their luggage, but also their normative traditions, namely elements of Islamic legal cultures expressing their respective identities as moral and social beings that are confronted with another, whose otherness is often not well understood from both sides, by the way. Let me take another example. The sometimes incomprehensible fact of Brexit in 2017 had a lot to do with the feeling of strangeness that European law represented for a lot of people living in Great Britain. And this is represented on this book, Some Colors of the Law, an exhibition I have done at King's College in 2017 and 2018. My argument is that communication between different legal cultures is not only necessary for, so to say, technical reasons when you are doing transnational business or political bargaining. That's so the utilitarian justification for that. But it is an important, if not crucial, element in the processes of taking the role of the other, of communicating between cultures and civilizations, especially if you want to go beyond the container model. To bridge the gap is even difficult for specialists in the field. I had the chance to propose a model of training for juristic interculturality at Abu Dhabi some years ago, where I proposed to bring in the life world of teaching and of learning the law in madrasas, in other schools, in university type of teaching the law, in order to bring the background, the context into the game of interaction between legal cultures to be learned. For those who are specialists in the world might at least bring some more understanding of the other by way of doing more legal hermeneutics. But it is even much more problematic when it comes to ordinary people, because in any developed legal culture, the gap between Volksrecht, law of the people, and Juristenrecht, doctrinal law of the juristic profession, the gap is so deep within a legal culture that transcending beyond the borders of validity camps becomes so much the more complex. By widening the concept of the law from a pure normativism to symbolic and ritual dynamics, let me give you the image of the theater of law and its organizational form. Legal orders seem to become more sensitive, understandable in their working process, as it has often been represented in court TV shows and court movies all over the globe, though these representations are very often false. Of course, the question of how to understand the law, what is the concept of the law, has to do with bringing in the multitude of legal cultures from the beginning on. And this was our undertaking in the Center for Advanced Study Law as Culture, when from the very first moments on, the experiences with legal pluralism, especially in India, were included by way of fellows that came from India Upendra Bakshi and others, for example, where in order to develop the main concept of this undertaking, this was and had to go beyond a concept of the law that is linked to state law alone, as we will see. So I come to my next point in the realm of corona normativities. From that kind of starting point that may be complemented by an interest in the relation of law to religion, and religion had been the starting point of our discussion today, as a result and a dynamic factor in globalization, a surprising close relationship of law and the arts. Please allow me to mention that the comparison of law and music was taken as a keynote for the last international conference of the Musicologist Society in Bonn during the Beethoven festivities, and I'm proud to have been invited for this talk as director of the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg Recht als Kultur in order to talk about normative framing of musical effervescence. So also, as you have talked, Alexandra, about the role of music in interaction, the very moment was, in that very moment, it was clear that music can construct and open a very specific space of understanding. And we know how much it has been used in order to go beyond civilizations and beyond the limits of cultures and societies. All this merges in a kind of paradigm how to analyze law under the conditions of globalization. In this sense, it has been completely normal to throw an eye on the pandemic through the lenses of the law as culture paradigm, because apparently a lot of action, political, social, cultural, etc., is at least formulated in normative terms. In yesterday's German news, the first point has been as follows: Ab heute gelten neue Corona-Regeln in Bayern. Morgen werden es andere sein. The pandemic crisis is not only a challenge for societies, but also for the sciences, as we know. The type of question has changed over time. One could link the crisis to the well-known topoi in the field of cultural studies we all have done during the pandemic period, in the structuring of time and space, the focalization of the body, the impact on different spheres of social life in politics, in the economics, in science, life worlds, including families, schools, etc. More systematic attempts try to work out the implications for the organizing principle of modern societies, namely the effect on the differentiation or de-differentiation of social systems and the consequences for the integration level in societies, including mechanical or organic types of solidarity. I will come back to this point. For a comparative and global perspective on world society or world community, the question arose whether we simply have to lay a corona color over the well-known cultures of modernities, or whether the combination of a sanitarian crisis, as French people call it, with existing structures would lead to new differences. For the question urgently arose: how can the differences in the success of fighting the pandemic be explained in different readiness to obey rules or the respective cultures of sanctions? These and other questions come up when observing the monstrous laboratory of normativity, as we have been invited to enter by way of the corona crisis. So in the range of normativities that are implied is, this is enormously broad, as you can see in the table. It goes from hygienic rules to the vestimentary codes. In corona times, we are sitting in a in a Zoom conference, and so we don't see our shoes and our trousers, etc. But so some of us will remain rather correct in this kind of doing Corona fashion. The types of normative orders are different. Legal sanctions, Corona manners are interesting. We have made studies about Corona manners, Corona fashion, as I mentioned before, Corona morals, conditioned Corona promises of deconfinement, etc. So, and the whole range of spheres of social life that had been under the rule of Corona normativities is to be seen on the left side. The rise of a new type of pandemic validity culture was therefore the question that I tried to understand better. The validity culture of the state of emergency, that is, of the Corona emergency, is as an ideal type determined by the unlimited power to suspend the entire existing normative order and align it with the extraordinaries of war, plague, or cultures completed by respective sanction cultures. In opposition to Agamben's view, heavily criticized, meanwhile, even by his personal friends, lies in the fact that the pandemic validity culture functions as an ideal type to be more or less realized in realities without drawing those consequences of making society an assemblage of homo sapiens. So I might show you this image. The ideal type of a pandemic validity culture looks like follows. It allows, by the way, to transcend the differences of legal cultures insofar as it produces a legitimate normative order through the reference of the pandemic. Thereby, it is not said that the validity culture by procedure, as we would say for positive law in Western societies, for example, became obsolete, or the distinction between secular or sacred validity cultures, that means those that work and explode and have their dynamics according to their reference to the sacred or to profane issues, would have lost their importance. But this type of creating a specific sphere of normativity has its own logic as it is represented in this image. It is a symbolic validity to be distinguished from a normative validity, organizational elements, and ritual dynamics that bring about a whole type of validity culture, by the way, a term that has been developed when looking at Islamic legal cultures, especially when it was not so much to do to specify what is the specific problematic of Islamic legal cultures in the fusion, sometimes confusion, or collaboration of the profane and the sacred, a state of less differentiated spheres of the law, religion, morale, manners, etc., a specific type of normativities that has its similarities and its elective affinity, so to say, with other legal cultures that are constructed by the same reference to religion. And this has been an interesting insight during the first period of the center, and then it has been transformed to the type that we observe at least during the last month and more than 1 year, as being the normative framing of our everyday life during the pandemic. I come to the next point, and I have to look at the time that remains in order to show that some of the problems we live in at the moment have to do with the fact that law, normativity, obeying the rules of distancing, etc., we know, I don't have to repeat that, are taken as a medical type and medical kind of remedy. You will be safe if you obey the rules. And it is a link that we never had before in this direct way between rule behavior, rule-oriented behavior, and being safe and being sane. So this is a very specific element in our in the Corona times, and so I think it is worthwhile to have a look at it and to see perhaps also why sometimes it is so difficult to work with this kind of medical instrument that is, in the end, normativities, norms. So there is a risk of arbitrariness, as you can imagine. So must it be 100, 150 centimeters? Of course, if you start a discussion about that, the basis of this norm may erode. Nature-induced contingencies from a certain level of incidences, certain legal types and rule types will prevail. So this is also contingent. It may change from one day to the other. There may be logics in that, but it may also be completely irrational. So to bind the rule validity to those natural elements, you take a certain risk for the acceptance, for the legitimacy of normative orders. The scientific culture of doubt, we do remember that. It is the normal fact of our scientific discussions that we have different opinions, that there is a fight about the best interpretation of the world. This is true for cultural studies and cultural sciences, the humanities, but it is also true for natural sciences, for medicine, as we know. And this type of debate that we had was not always very helpful for the legitimacy, for those persons at least, who are not familiar with the fact that science means fight over the best interpretation. Paradox of distancing as sociality. So of course we know how we felt with that, to be so far away from the other and no longer to experience otherness through the body, through the touching, there was a real, literal taboo to not to be too close to the other, by sounds, by smile, by gestures, by everything. We don't have sufficient systematic studies about what this kind of Stimmung, atmosphere, what co-presence, physical co-presence really means. But we know very well what was missing. And to accept such a paradox and to admit it and to take it for legitimate is not easy, has not been easy for all of us. And the risk of confusing civil disobedience with corona denial, for example, I don't have to talk about that. So I come to my conclusion, and I think I'm still rather within the time schedule that was given. And I come to some transcultural experiences. Durkheimian analysis of the difficulties of implementing, I'm on the wrong part, but I find it back. I come to the conclusion. So the exchange with former fellows and friends from the Maghreb to New York and from Paris to South Africa, Australia, produced most fascinating contributions to an understanding of the pandemic in a global context. So this was a multifunctional undertaking. It had also to do with strengthening our resilience forces, so to say, when working about this topic. I've done not only this volume that I may show to you, but there is a second one that is underway and should be sent to the editor, to the publishing house, it is rather sick, as you can see. Of course, had the latent function to be very busy with collecting contributions, ordering them, and to make some sense of them. What kind of sense? Masahiro Noguchi has shown that Japan's cluster strategy for managing the pandemic can be better understood by looking at the meaning of traditional concepts how to deal with such situations, Tatemashi and Yishuku, as ways to relate to such situations. Borders gained a new symbolic meaning, denying in a way the Schengen Convention in Europe. Special attention has accordingly been cast on legal barriers of national border restrictions by a fellow from who worked in Paris and in Berlin. Dieter Gosewinkel, Jure Leko, has focused on spatial mobility in Europe during the corona crisis. And the question of border is in this context, of course, also a symbolic and a very substantive one. But has COVID-19 brought an end to globalization? We speak in the context of a global world. Was one question that one of the founders of globalization theory in the 90s, namely Martin Albro, also a former fellow, replies to in a negative way. We have to distinguish between the categories of totalization and globalization that allow the specific event of a total global moment in the world. That is, as we have seen in former discussions of our debates in the CALAS context, more and more to be seen as the blue planet. The methodologically embarrassing and never answered question, how can we transcend the subjectivity of our worldview in order to get access to the other by way of interaction als Wechselwirkung, as we once again learned today, may also be replied by imagination. For Georg Simmel, in his famous digression on the stranger, it was important to make a distinction between the inhabitants of a planet, like the Sirius, and the stranger in society. But our awareness in the Anthropocene has changed. Reading how the Petit Prince might have imagined from the experience of his little planet, the crisis we live in, and this wonderful story is written in French by poet and legal theorist François Ost, will constitute the opening of the second volume of our studies in corona normativities. This is also to deal with the other otherness, imagined otherness. The other is not only living in Africa, by the way, suffering in the academic world by technical restrictions, as I mentioned before, in the communication and uncertainties of international mobility, as Kioma Daisy Onyege from Nigeria explains, as a former fellow and now a fellow at the Excellence Cluster Beyond Slavery, but sometimes in Beverly Hills, walking the dogs, being bored to death and feeling imprisoned as never, as Katja Spranz has shown by observing celebrities in Corona land. From a legal perspective, Christa Rautenbach, a former fellow, too explains the many colors of COVID-19 in South Africa, not surprisingly, alongside old and new social inequality lines. In the end, we see that the promise of a normative cure does not help. Neither does rule obedience lead to the healing of society, nor does it come to an end of rule-oriented strategies to combat the crisis, as we can learn from our everyday life experiences. What remains is a profound discomfort, Unbehagen, with the current crisis. We have no meta-récit, neither de-differentiation or super-differentiation processes, as Daniel Witte has demonstrated in a profound theoretical contribution in the second volume. No civilizational break by way of the culture of exception, we could precisely identify, but a worldwide strategy to solve the endangerment of social order by way of bringing more normativity into the game. This reminds me the Hobbesian solution to the problem of order, and that is why Leviathan is represented on the cover of the first and the second volume, entitled In the Realm of Corona Normativities. So I come to my end. Thank you very much for your attention. My email address, whenever you might be interested to communicate and dialogue with me, you are invited to do that. I would be very glad to exchange with you. And so I am at the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your wonderful attention.
Thank you very much, all of you, for this really wonderful presentations. I just look out. Yeah. I think you really, the three papers, and you all opened really a tableau of different aspects, starting with Martin Fuchs and his rather theoretical considerations that lay groundwork for the later papers about what is a dialogue, what is intercultural. We could also discuss later on the understanding of inter and transcultures compared to Werner Gephart, the problem of container terms we know so well and we deconstruct now since years, and they are still so powerful everywhere. And what I think is very ground laying for our discussion here are you highlighted that there are different kinds of intercultural dialogues, and we always have to see and have to really look into these differences. And this, the two following papers did very concretely making this, how different intercultural dialogue can be, very clear for everybody. Alexandra Cuffel with songs, and I mean audio history is really a new aspect also we have to consider. And I was wondering there how important songs were pre-Reformation, but maybe I ask this question in more detail later. But also Alexandra Cuffel with this to compare the intercultural dialogues in the Middle East and in Central Europe, which is quite so different power asymmetries. Yeah, I thought that's all that was so. Yeah, you saw these different kinds, and then Werner Gephart opening the legal field, and I mean legal pluralism in itself is of course an intercultural dialogue of very different kinds, depending on times, depending of regions, world regions. And again, it became so clear that law is, as you highlighted, not only with Corona, but generally not just a normative system, but we cannot understand the dialogue with laws, with the legal elements without discussing and understanding intercultural dialogue. Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to ask the audience for questions. Or maybe, of course, also you can ask each other questions. And Werner Gephart started already with that, asking Alexandra Cuffel. Should we maybe start before we have somebody else with this question? Do you want to repeat it, or do you want to answer directly, Alexandra?
Okay, let me repeat what I wrote down, and please correct me if I didn't quite understand it or didn't write it down correctly. If there was a kind of normative framing of interaction, particularly in the context of convivencia, and asked about whether there's kind of questions of cultures of interculturality and law. Is that more or less summarize what you wanted to ask me?
Very precisely what I was asking.
Okay.
Yes.
So I guess first, before I answer that, I would have a question of you. Do you mean that, do you want to know about a cultural normativity during the Middle Ages, or a culture of normativity in studying intercultural encounters, basically modern scholars and how they examine. I wasn't quite sure which of these two you meant or both.
I'm interested in both, but my question is directed towards the medieval situation. For example, Mr. Przybyelski from Trier, who is a specialist from the Judaistic point of view, was a fellow at our center. We had a lot of discussions, and Raja Sakrani, she's a specialist in, she's a coordinator at our center, and she worked about Andalusia together with the Max Planck Institute for Europäische Rechtsgeschichte in Frankfurt. And they had a project for several years about the idea of convivencia and also its normative framing. And so my question was whether not only for Andalusia, where it is defined, at least from a Muslim point of view, who the other is, who has the quality of the other, and what the role of the other is. This is in this tradition, but how you see that also for let me say, the French or German situation. Is there something, a necessity of that, or something you have in mind that makes the embraces this kind of possibility of exchange that is not just the physical presence of neighborhood. Neighborhood always works in the Maghrebinian world. I know it is a very important factor. But do you see something that made this kind of an ethic of tolerance or whatever? I'm ignorant.
Okay. So if I understood your question correctly, certainly in the legal traditions, both more locally, so in French or Germanic speaking lands, you have regulations that recognize the existence of foreigners who might be Christian or Jews or people in some ways who are seen as outside or marginal to the main form of society. And I think at one point we talked about hierarchies of, there was a discussion of hierarchies of tolerance. I wouldn't quite use the word tolerance perhaps, but these people were part of that society, but at the same time, there was an attempt to set up regulations about how they may or may not function in society and interact or be part of the larger part of what the makers of the law wanted to identify as the majority culture. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but as far as I understand, yes. Also, though, it's important to keep in mind that those religious cultural groups who did not have political power also had cultures of law or normativity about how to deal with people they consider to be outside of their community. So you have, when looking at this question, you have to ask yourself, well, what was the law for example, northern France and Christians there? And then also, how did the Jews understand that? And then you, above that, of course, you have, well, not above, but along with that, you also have canon law from the church itself, and those all interact. Is that what you meant?
Yes, and so a lot of questions would arise in consequence of what you said, how to find a commonality in interpreting, and where conflicting interpretations of those normative orders that are not identical, how this at least was accommodated. And so this is a long history, I know, and you can't answer that in one sentence or two sentences. But thank you very much for the hint to the solution to that.
This is a moment.
Thank you.
And this is a moment where we really miss the coffee breaks, where we could go on with these discussions and ask all these questions. Olaf Kaltmeier.
Yeah, thank you so much for these inspiring talks. I have a question to Martin and Werner. To Martin first, I really liked your approach of overcoming this container thinking of identities, of group thinking, of groupism in culture. But I have a question: how to deal? As I understood you, you proposed that the starting point for analysis or research is this zone of entanglements, of interpersonal interpersonal involvement, and how do more structural elements like discourses, dispositives, or even more structural aspects come into this research? Or that would be my question to your presentation. And to Werner, I find it very interesting, this so to say normative approach to the pandemic in a certain way, and obviously what you have called also the relation of this the effects this normative approach has to social order, obeying to the rules established, etc. And I asked myself, well, there would have been another possibility, which is not so much based in law and the state of exception in a certain way, but in biopolitics, so the liberation of vaccines and a more, so to say, an approach to the academics in that field, liberating the production of vaccines through the WTO and so on. So I don't. How would you see this tension of possible two approaches?
Okay.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, should I start reply? I also wanted to reply to Mark Gephart, but I start with Olaf's question. When the zone of entanglement, that was for me one particular case. When meant entanglements of reference frames of very different origins. When the reference frame, Referenzrahmen, I use to cover different modes of discourses, ideologies, modes of thinking, all these kind of terms. So it's a more kind of abstract terminology. When my ideas, and I basically, to some extent, base myself on Joachim Renn's book, Übersetzungsverhältnisse, is that each, what we call a society, let's take our modern German society, we have different functional systems, we have different integrative units, we have different organizations, we have different registers on which we work and argue, and we, in addition, have different reference frames. Yeah? And they are not monolithic, so to say, not one reference frame completely identical with one functional system. Yeah? Functional system could be law, could be the economics, could be the political world, could be all kinds of public discourses, could be the world of science, etc. You couldn't just extend on that. So all of us automatically engage with several of these functional systems. We all argue on several levels and with several registers, etc. I can just expand on that. So none of us lives in one context only. So if we have this intercontextuality as a basic dimension of human life, yeah, we should start from that. And then what we call, in a strong sense of the term, intercultural, is just a version of that. Yeah, it might be very extreme. There might be certain situations where there are clashes in a big way. But we have also clashes between the functional system of law and economics, etc. Yeah? That's not too different. Yeah, so that's my thing. Then with regard to reference frames, and this is the world of interpretation, of imagination, of arguing, of developing new ideas, etc., etc. So these then develop into certain theories, certain discourses, etc. And these can also travel more easily than others. Yeah? So my example usually is Buddhism. Buddhism it started in the northern part of India and quickly traveled to most parts of Asia, but not the social practices related. And of course, these started certain forms of religious practice, but they also adapted. These also adapted to the context. You could continue with that. So reference frames can travel and then are appropriated locally. So that's the model on which I'm working. So if we start from that, then we can also easily understand that there are people who have always lived in a plural context, a context where there are several religions side by side, several forms of life side by side. So different religions will share a world, which is partly referred to also in the other presentation of where's she now? Of Alexandra Cuffel. But I mean, in India, this was the general situation. So we have started to approach these from identity labels. Someone is a Hindu, someone is a Muslim, etc. But this is not having the case. These words were not around in certain times. So there was this openness. Of course, there were also fights and certain kind of dogmas which someone tried to defend or to push through. So that's my. I can continue as you say with that. I have a question, a remark regarding Mark Gephart. I mean, you had put the question, and Alexandra had already responded to that. Of is there a normative framing for interculturality or intercontextuality? I mean, the issue is this normative framing. When you talk about framing, then it's something explicit. And the discussion was partly also about explicit ethics. Yeah? But in many situations where you have not yet developed this strong boundary thinking, the exchanges across differences happens in everyday life, in situationally, and people do not necessarily make it explicit. Yeah, so there is of course an inbuilt normativity or inbuilt implicit normativities, but which then again are context specifically applied. Yeah? So if once you try to define them, then you have to formulate a certain normative rules, yeah, which is not how life is led. Yeah, so I would just suggest that one distinguishes between these two levels or layers of normativity.
Thank you very much, Antje. May I answer to that now?
I am just a bit confused because I had you on my list, Martin, for a question. So yeah, I think you answer now. Then Alexandra Cuffel had her hand. And Martin, do you have another question, or can I erase you from my list?
You can raise me. This was the reply to the question.
Okay.
Werner Gephart.
Thank you. So please, Werner, and afterwards, Alexandra. Thank you.
So I would absolutely like to foster this position of the context, the importance of the context, and I may quote Karl Marx, who said in 48, bei der Rezeption der frühen Sozialisten hatte man nur vergessen, die Lebensverhältnisse mit einwandern zu lassen. And this is a materialistic interpretation of translation that gives a very heavy importance to the context, and the context that is not only references of interpretation, but also substantive conditions of life that sometimes make the traveling of concepts more difficult and the reception more complex. And so in this context, I would also like to mention that, of course, the old tradition of reception in legal history developed with regard to Roman law. Rezeption des Römischen, the reception of Roman law, is a classical topic in legal history. But it's interesting how this has been received in Asian countries. And this has been another book that had been published in our series dealing just with this question, where also the question of interculturality, interregionality, and interhistoricity as a further complexity of this process had been treated with. Very shortly to the question of, and the remark of Olaf Kaltmeier. Of course, I do not pretend that the normative paradigm would explain the whole complex of corona habits, corona activities, and corona behavior as such. But I think it is one point that is underestimated and not explicitly spoken out. On the other hand, the biopolitics line of argumentation is very, very important, and in our study, it was represented by historians of medicine and others. Of course, it has to be combined with. That would be my answer, but thank you for the question.
Alexandra?
Sure. I wanted to say, in regards to Professor Fuchs's remarks and talk, I mean, I very much agree with this idea of multiple modes of existence or culture, if you want to call it that, and the tendency to the problem of putting them in individual baskets and treating them as if they were monolithic. But I think not having adopted your particular vocabulary, one of the things I would say is worth noting what's going on is that people who wrote about intercultural, if you want to call it, or entangled relations between peoples, they wanted to create those baskets as much as their modern contemporaries in many ways. And what you see in religious polemics is an attempt to view those primarily in a monolithic way, only from the realm of religious belonging and what that particular author considered to be proper religious affiliation, if you want, normative affiliation. And part of what I am in some ways trying to get at is that they attempt to elide over, for example, that Jewish and Christian mothers at some point in their interactions or dealing with how to take care of their children were functioning perhaps primarily in the mode of being a parent rather than, say, their religious identities. But those who wrote about it were not always willing to recognize that.
Martin?
Alexandra, do I understand you correctly that you think of construction of religious identities or religious frameworks already before modernity? Yeah, yeah, okay. And that's what I partly hinted at. The form of religion in the Abrahamic tradition is very different from the forms of religion in other parts of the world. They have the South Asian ones. I know much less about the East Asian ones and Southeast Asian ones. Yeah? And of course, I don't know anything about the pre-Columbian American ones. Yeah? But in the Indian context, we had strong struggles between different thoughts of thinking, of philosophers, of metaphysicians, of people who started a new kind of praxis, but they always related to the others. So there was a constant dialogue between these. They tried to include the others. You know? That's the term of inclusivism. Yeah, and if they saw each other on the same level, then they had this constant exchange. And so the ideas were developed in that form of dialogue. The idea of Hinduism didn't exist. There was nothing of a Hinduism. There was not even Vaishnavism or Shaivism, yeah, in the earlier times. You had specific thinkers who had specific schools or specific sampradayas. I don't want to use Indian terms now here. So the kind of clear-cut separation of religions in the Indian subcontinent is a new model, which was introduced with modernity, with colonialism, and is, of course, now leading the nationalist politics. The religious nationalism grew out of that, yeah? But it is not the original, and there's still something left of this earlier permeability between different religious strands on the Indian subcontinent.
I'd very much like to encourage people who follow us from all the other channels to give some questions, yeah? Because of course we can have a great discussion here, but maybe you have, so please ask. But I saw, Werner Gephart, you also you raised your hand very, yeah?
Yes, but I would like to ask you, Martin, are the Dalits a colonial invention?
This is a completely different question. Yeah, no, they are not. I mean, the term Dalits is a new one. It was introduced by members of that wide category of people in the 1970s, and was partly used already, but not very frequently in the 19th century. Yeah, this kind of hierarchy and then exclusion of others goes side by side with this plurality and openness, which I pointed towards. So I mentioned that briefly, the stigmatization of certain sections, yeah, which today is also then applied to Muslims. Yeah? So that's the other side of the story. Within the groups we call ex-untouchables, or who call themselves Dalits. Not everyone calls themselves. It's a very loose category with a very different, wide range of different jatis or castes within. They followed the same openness with respect to each other. I mean, one of the models which I partly refer to, the model of respect, is what I learned among the Dalits in the largest slum in Mumbai, in which I worked for the long-term field work. When you had members of the same caste, one was a classical Hindu, one was a Buddhist, one was a Christian, one was a recently converted Muslim, and they respected each other. Each religion had its plus points, and each religion had its weak points. Yeah? So they could discuss about that. Yeah. So when this openness I found fascinating, even in today's time. Yeah. Yeah, but when the question about what the hierarchies and endogamy, etc., this is a different question. It's nothing to do with our topic here. Well, it of course interrupts cross different exchange across differences. That, of course, yeah. This is it's the other side, the other story, which I would always include in the picture. Yeah.
You have also fascinating topics and papers, and for the coffee break, I would have very deep question for all of you. But for this, I'd like to put it a bit on a more abstract level. Coming from the cluster in Heidelberg, Asia and Europe, we always said we don't want to talk about Asians, we want to talk with Asians. And so I would like to know, beside the topic of your specific paper today, how is the intercultural dialogue important for your academic work, and what problems do you face there? And my feeling is that in some parts of the world just now, it's even more difficult because we are interested in intercultural, transcultural, all that, and there are many parts are very much into national, and it seems to me, looking from Bielefeld, it's getting more and more difficult. But yeah, I'd like to know what are your experiences, what are the problems, the chances?
I don't want to occupy the screen. Well, there are several levels to that. I purposely coined the title of my talk anthropological, because as an anthropologist, you stay with people, you live with people, you share life with people in a specific context, yeah? And then you somehow step by step get closer and closer to people. There's always the knowledge that one has different backgrounds, but one shares more and more things, and the friends and people with whom one lives, yeah, have an interest in us as well, yeah. So it's in a way reciprocal when we have a bit larger resources in many cases, but sometimes we even we did that. We invited people who lived there in a village or in Islam to Germany and to then see how we live here. So that's a kind of we are humans, and then we share. We share issues, we share dilemmas, we share crises in such situations. The other is what you might refer to as the academic exchanges, yeah? And then the Merian centers are a good example that this is an possibility when we are building on earlier interactions and networks, and then the discussion of topics has people from different backgrounds, and so it's issue-wise how we discuss, yeah, and we invite each other back and forth. There's of course, yeah, there's less of a dominance, at least with respect to India, of Western scholarship than it might be in other parts of the world. There is of course this, yeah, and then you can discuss the episteme and where do we derive the episteme from? How much can we still save of the earlier episteme which existed before colonial powers impacted on these sites? When they are still available, but they have been broken. So it's a very, very complex question. But yeah, so yeah.
Okay.
If I may join you, sorry. If I may join you.
I think Alexandra was first.
Oh, yes, please. Of course.
Okay. Just directly to your question, I think I would say more broadly, having been within the KHK, one of the things that struck me when I first joined was the difference between, even within Europe, of academic cultures and so forth, and then of course the issue of what religio-cultural background individuals belong to. Differences between, since our KHK focused on Europe and Asia, the differences between academic cultures of Asia and Europe became far more striking, and it was sometimes a struggle to bring more people from Asia to join with us in that, or to fully understand what the other sort of theoretical perspectives and so forth were. But that was something we worked at a great deal. For myself and my own research since then, since I've been working on the Jewish-Christian interactions in Asia and Africa, it became increasingly vital to include the perspectives of scholars from those regions, but at the same time having to deal with disruptions, for example, the current war in Ethiopia, and so forth, has really caused a great deal of difficulty in continuing those kinds of exchanges. So,
thank you.
If we are asked about the question how to experience the multiculturality, so to say, and transculturality in the context of a Center for Advanced Study, Käthe Hamburger Kolleg. This is, of course, a privileged location for such interactions. As you mentioned before, Martin, of course, it goes back to relations we established before in our academic life. Otherwise, it would not be possible to invite people and to get acquainted with them and to create this kind of mutual confidence that is necessary in order to make such a jump into a completely different culture. So insofar, I'm very optimistic. We had people from very interesting researchers from India, from Africa, from Senegal, from North Africa, from the Maghrebinian world, from Australia, etc. And it went also back. So to give you an example, so I will make a project with about normativité pratique, la solidarité à l'épreuve de Covid-19. Allemagne, France, Marok, Senegal. Das wird also ein Projekt sein, wo diese Perspektive der pandemischen Geltungskultur weiter verfolgt wird, in between Morocco, Senegal, France and Germany. So this is very convincing and I like that very much. On the other side, to imply people from Africa, from India, to become members of our academic world. That is, to become a professor at our universities would be the step that I would wish in order to really implement perspectives more efficiently. But there has always been a kind of not a direct rejection, but I'm very much astonished if French is taught by people who do not speak French, because they are not French, and you can't speak French if you have not done this process of socialization in the language in France or somewhere else at least. So I'm a little bit puristic in that, and I would expect that we would universities would be much more open to this kind of diversity also in their recruitment politics. This would be my wish. In Bonn, we have opened a Forschungsstelle diversity where we discuss about those questions, but one has to see whether it will be realized. But it is an absolutely important, crucial point for the logic of a Center for Advanced Study of the Merian or Hamburger type. And I'm very thankful that it was possible to realize in a way that would never have been possible in the normal academic life of a German university if we would not have the means to do that, and the interest and the push to go into this direction. It is very necessary, and it should be a model for the whole university. That's at least the lesson that some of us have drawn from the experiences with this kind of knowledge format. I was too long, excuse me.
And my feeling is that this Merian Center and the Käthe Hamburger Center are also very innovative compared to some other institutions from other countries. So it seemed to me, what I hear from Olaf, from Eleonora Roland, it's very much on eye level, more than what sometimes other nations do. Alexandra, please.
Yes, I'd like to add a little bit to what Professor Gephart mentioned. I think it's correct that incorporating people from whether it's the Global South or a variety of other regions into the German academic system as professor is an excellent step. But I also think what I find is that to do that requires us to potentially rethink disciplinary boundaries as well, because for example, in history, if most of what is in a history department is focused on German or European history, and there's no place for the teaching of, say, Chinese history or multiple epochs of Indian history and so forth, as understood as part of that discipline, then it becomes hard to incorporate these other voices within the academy here. That's all.
Thank you so much. I don't see further questions, and we have 5 more minutes before the coffee break we don't have. So you see how important I think coffee breaks are. So often I talk about them. I think we can go into the break, Olaf, or we can, yeah. So thank you all so much again. It was a pleasure to listen to you. I learned a lot and it was really intriguing. And I hope to see all of you 6:15 again. Same Zoom, yeah? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming again for the second part of our not conference but nowadays event, the third day of the BMBF network conference. The second part is an interregional dialogue, and I'm very happy to welcome here again, you've been there before, Professor Dr. Sarah Corona and Professor Dr. Olaf Kaltmeier. Allow me some technical remarks before we go into, before I introduce both. We will talk, Sarah Corona will talk 20 minutes, afterwards Olaf Kaltmeier will talk 10 minutes. The first paper will be, or speech will be in Spanish, the second in English, as I understood. We have a button for interpreting it, so on the down, it is the last one on the right, so that you can understand in English or in Spanish. Yeah, I'm very happy to introduce the 2 directors of the CALAS Maria Merian Center, Professor Dr. Sarah Corona at the Guadalajara University, Olaf Kaltmeier here in Bielefeld, here because I'm in Bielefeld too. Sarah Corona did her doctorate in communication from the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, very close to Bielefeld in some ways, and is currently a professor at the University of Guadalajara, a position she previously held at the Metropolitan Autonomous University at its Xochimilco campus. She has many very important books and papers, but I don't want to go too deep into it because we are much more, not much more, but we're very much interested in the discussion the 2 of you have later on. The second one, Professor Dr. Olaf Kaltmeier, here from the Professor of Ibero-American History of the University of Bielefeld, and is a very estimated and treasured colleague here in Bielefeld. With this, he also serves at the executive board of the Center for Inter-American Studies, the CIAS, and also, of course, if you see too many papers to really, too many books and articles, so that I cannot refer to them here in detail. Thank you so much, and please, Sarah, you start as I understand, and then Olaf, please.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I would like to applaud the title of this conference, looking at borders and black holes in academic production. I have a great deal in common with the colleagues who have spoken previously in today's event. And I look forward to talking in more detail about interculturality and dialogue, but looking at horizontality as we call it here at CALAS. The fundamental interest that we have at CALAS is how can we generate new knowledge to confront the social problems that afflict us today? The new questions that arise from new contexts force us to think that traditional disciplinary methods are reaching their limits when it comes to understanding current phenomena. My very short presentation has to do with what we have called horizontal production of knowledge, which is to say a form of research that engages in dialogue with the diverse manners of understanding the world and that many times are not heard loudly. Assuming that those involved in the problems also have solutions leads us to propose ways of listening, responding, and confronting the problems that threaten the world and our social life. Our disciplinary knowledge that we have accumulated over time is not sufficient, to now propose economic and cultural political solutions that are coherent with the lives of the many different people who cohabit social spaces. It seems that the traditional methods of science with scientific criteria have been devastated by a new context, and today these investigations are condemned to fail, mute, or repeat the knowledge built in other times and from other places. We ask ourselves, for example, about peace processes, political ups and downs in Latin America. What do current populisms and social democracies of a new type? These are a new type, and all we see is a matter of handing out money to groups considered vulnerable. What do those who are labeled as vulnerable actually think about equality and emancipation? It's clear that there are new problems, and the crises that we are facing are 21st century problems, but we do not have sufficient methods to investigate and respond to new questions. Our proposal, when it comes to horizontal knowledge production, is related to finding the right ways to respond to social questions, starting with a new knowledge model, which is open to transformation at any moment in time. And so I would like to talk about what we mean when we talk about horizontal knowledge production very, very quickly. I have three concepts here. Dialogue. So here I would like to refer to the political momentum that dialogue has. Here we look at having communication amongst different parties in a public space. In other words, the human capacity where both the listener and the speaker converse. This is different to the techno-communicative model where we have a source of information transmitting a message through a device. Where listeners become speakers and speakers become listeners, the conversation takes place under other terms. This means that the speakers produce something different, responses that are translated at each step of the process and also enables alternative answers. The second axis or concept is conflict generator. Dialogue brings us to the second point. What do I mean when I say conflict generator? We here talk about communication with others, and as a starting point, all communication is problematic. Here we look at different disciplines and perspectives and points of view. It's even more of a conflict when we have extremely different perspectives from different disciplines or external voices from outside of academic research. When it comes to horizontal knowledge production, we have conflict as a generative condition. Here, where we see conflict to build something new. The result of generative conflict are dialogues that are profoundly productive, that are pregnant with potential new worldviews and new ways of perceiving the world. The great lesson of history of research is that knowledge develops from the conflict of different points of view. And therefore, a consensual view generally atrophies because it does not allow us to see the problems behind this consensus. The meaning of dialogue considered here, rather than bringing two different positions closer together so that they can get to know one another and understand one another or reach a consensus, refers to the fact of accepting different hybrid and subversive positions in order to produce a new research at the service of a horizontal interpretation of the social world. And the third element is the concept of discursive equality. Given that conflictive generation has nothing to do with harmonic forms, to incorporate the voice of others without compromising one's own hegemonic principles of research, building mutual knowledge has to establish conditions of equality that chart a path towards a more equitable autonomy of one's own gaze. There is a feeling of equality that is related to the political space as two different processes coming together. We have public policy and emancipation processes. On the one hand, we have public policies that name and thus label subjects or people as subjects and classify them on a social scale. These names are constructed along with values and social locations. The academic myth of research divides intelligences into two parts: the researcher who knows how to respond and the researcher who knows how to reason. The researcher who is non-horizontal practices his or her methods and techniques, for example, carrying out interviews, surveys, etc., with research subjects, and in doing so shows his or her superiority. This is different to horizontal knowledge production, where everybody has their own knowledge and their own methods. In this way, horizontal researchers call themselves peer researchers, which is a concept which is central to horizontal knowledge creation. And here we have other names used that promote discursive equality. The difference between a peer researcher and the researched is the difference between responding to social problems as a researcher or as the research. When the relationship exists between peers, we see a dialogue, which is different to when a researcher, which is posed by the researcher. And so here we see the production of new knowledge when we overcome this society of those who have knowledge and those who do not. I will now talk about horizontal methods and their relationship with institutions. So, here we look at how institutions produce knowledge to meet their own objectives. We have differences between financing or traditional financing institutions and those current institutions. What are the limits and scopes here? And can we see progress made towards horizontality in the production of knowledge from current institutions? So I would now like to refer to some initial reflections at CALAS with Olaf to think about the institution of international cooperation from a different perspective. As opposed to institutions of international cooperation that prevailed in the 20th century, where the metropolis and the periphery were traditional ways of looking at international relations. And now we would like to recognize institutional dynamics that today animate public policies, regimes, and processes for building new knowledge. Knowledge production institutions in the 21st century are more flexible, but at the same time more difficult to understand for this very same reason. We have a network like organizative institutions, recipient country political priorities, neo-intellectual extractivism, which make a challenge to study the impact of institutions when it comes to new valuable knowledge production.
Próximos minutos voy a hablar solamente de 4
So now I am going to talk about 4 subtopics regarding to knowledge production and the issues in the institutions. First of all, we have language. We know that researching in a single language means identifying that we are starting based on conflicts and that we want these conflicts to become generators of new knowledge. When we speak different languages, it is even harder to transform conflict into generating conflict. When we are able to respect all languages equally, we can reach a level of higher depth and greater scope of joint results. Of course, it is necessary to understand the other language, to translate it, or to start from a lingua franca. Generally, this first obstacle is overcome in a way or another, even though some participants will have a poorer knowledge of the other language or even of the lingua franca. Actually, to begin with, it makes their participation more fragile, and the working group must take responsibility for overcoming these disadvantages. But there are language problems that require a greater effort and a greater time that oftentimes the institutions do not fully understand. research of Ready Transit Research, which is a group of international researchers on religious issues conducted between Africans, French, Americans, and Mexicans. They actually appointed Mexican researchers because they didn't want to be considered researchers from the South nor Central American. Undoubtedly, because they were used to, despite everything and despite being the North American continent, and they would rather reflect on transnational differences as well as international regimes as compared to the northern models. This is an illustrative example because in addition to this research, this was conducted with Mexican migrants in the United States, where the concept of the South didn't correspond to the Mexican identities that live in the United States, nor to the explanation of their cultural production, nor to the ways of identities that Chicanos implement in their practices and the context of fight for the recognition of their cultural identity of their citizenship. At CALAS, as I said before, the right to the name ourselves allows us to highlight the names that each person wishes to be named. 2, the definition of research. The problems to define research, whatever is researchable, have their origin in the old ways of conducting social research. I am talking about the division of knowledge production, and when it consisted in the North generating the theories and the South providing with the raw materials to carry out the research. In other words, collecting information in the field and processing it according to the theories of the North. In this way, the South became a maquiladora or a producer of scientific production of the North. The danger of this collaborative research is that conventional thinking and knowledge of the North is positioned, as Sosa Santos says, as the center of research. The problem, as we see it, is not the autonomy of the visions in conflict, but it is the capacity of the South to contribute to the reconstruction of its own nations as modern nations of a new kind of modernity. At CALAS, it's not about letting everyone live or research in their own way, but to let ourselves be touched by the other and to go from their side with the other to understand the problem from their own perspective, and finally to let ourselves be transformed by the other to build together undoubtedly and create new knowledge. Third, funding. The financial support issue for research and transnational projects is complicated. By formally coming from the North, this means that roles can be confused and not be established according to the competence of the participating researchers. During non-horizontal research, the authority of the funders is intended to count more. However, since these are cooperation issues with researchers from national networks, they should be valued at the same level in order to build a multi-centered network. The concept that is often held that the spaces where researchers gather, which are mainly in the South, are empty spaces, spaces to be occupied, is a mistaken idea. We can paraphrase the title of Subirats in his book on the conquest of America, which is entitled The Empty Continent. Sometimes it is mistakenly considered that the physical and symbolic spaces of the receivers of the South can be filled physically and symbolically by researchers from the North. On the other hand, we also mentioned that many cooperation funding agencies have some of their formats including financial support to researchers from the South, but in practice, the work is not funded in the North because rarely is it included as being of interest in the analysis of transnational problems, the study in the spaces of territories of the North. 4, the status of knowledge. We need to mention the inequitable status of knowledge and concepts. I am not only talking about the knowledge of those who are not academics and produce knowledge outside the academic context, such as indigenous communities, neighborhoods, or collectives, etc. That should always be taken into account in discursive equity. But I also refer to the concepts generated from the Academy of the South, where new forms of writing, own discursive genres in local languages, in hybrid formats, are not always considered by the globalized editorial production. Interaction between peer researchers is necessary to enrich knowledge, even more so if they are colleagues from different places. But we should not forget that interaction is marked by the very structure of the project. We need to understand that the rules imposed by the institutions to conduct research from above do not generate impact when they do not start from all parties involved. Not without us, this slogan and other similar intentions respond to a shared certainty. Progress is only made in the democratization and the fight against inequality if the limits are placed on exclusion. These are just some hypotheses about research in institutions, and it is also an invitation for us all to explore other horizontal ways of producing new knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Olaf, you want to directly go on?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I will go on directly. As we work in a kind of mutual mirroring, I will repeat probably in other words some aspect which shows a little bit this horizontal dialogue, and obviously probably some smaller differences in our approaches or our common approach. A fundamental background assumption of the horizontal production of knowledge is that our being in the world is always also a being with others. Thus the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy has emphasized that human existence is primarily not self-referential but embedded in a community, albeit a de-created one, Entwerkte in Alemann. The basic assumption of coexistence has been elaborated by the phenomenologist Bernhard Waldenfels to the effect that he understands the human being as homo respondens. With this, Waldenfels expresses, on the one hand, the social character of human beings, and on the other hand, the importance of authority. We human beings have to react to demands from outside, respond to others, be it others, other human beings, be it things around us, to process them and to respond to them. In this respect, our speech of others is provoked by others and affected by others. Such an understanding suggests that we also conceive of the world as a co-construction or co-evolution. In Colonial Constellation of Power, historian Sebastian Conrad and social anthropologists Shalini Randeria have argued similarly. Colonial expansion and the formation of the capitalist world system have created a shared history with variable interactions and a history of asymmetrical power relations, exploitation, and social inequality that is also a divided history. Both aspects are ambivalent forms of sociality and authority. Both aspects are very important for the co-construction of the world. Giving such a co-constructed, co-evolutionary world, the question is what this means for knowledge production. For knowledge production, I would like to distinguish between the production of the new and the novel, neuartig in German, new kind of elements. The new emerges basically within the frameworks of established orders or grids. Thus, for example, scientific disciplines. Etymologically, the double meaning of teaching and controlling is always contained in discipline. From disciplines that work as ordering grids, which create the possibility frameworks for new knowledge via rules and standardizations. Here, the main question for the production is for the new is what comes into being. When rules are creatively reshaped and transcended, something novel, neuartig, can emerge. The focus here is not on the product, so the what, but more on the process, the how. Novelty is always about new forms of thinking, perceiving, producing. Considering the responsive, dialogical point of departure, novelty would always emerge in a process of con-creativity and con-creation. In short, for Sarah Corona and me, a process of dialogical and horizontal knowledge production. What means reshaping the order and production of novelty in the process of con-creation, and what are limits to this process? Con-creativity is limited by vertical knowledge structures. So in an extractivistic or neo-extractivistic manner, usually the development and elaboration of sources or the provision of scientific resources are refined in the West and inserted into one's own knowledge order, or the knowledge order of the West, where basically the persons from third world or global South context are in the role of informants. This operation usually reinforces the othering of we versus us. Instead, horizontal knowledge production, mutual recognition of different knowledge orders, enables the construction of common levels of understanding and new kind of knowledge, novelties. Second, and Sarah talked also about that, we think that this dialogue and horizontal knowledge production does not mean to come necessarily to consensus. We think that difference, also in the Derridarian sense of difference with the A, of shift, is important. Dialogue is only possible through difference. And dialogue in this sense creates, so to say, new responses. But what is important, we think, is here that there must be a common concern, a feeling of being mutually addressed, and the knowledge production is basically important if we engage with a certain kind of strangeness. This has also been mentioned by Werner Gephart. So we have to, if not to address a stereotyped other, but a stranger in the sense of simul, because a stranger also has the potential to interrupt order and create something new in its interaction. Another aspect is not to merge into a collective subject in terms of simple theories of mestizaje, very common in Latin America. So in a dialectic process to come to from two antagonisms to a common idea. Instead, we think it's important to come to a conviviality in difference. And as Sigmund Baumann has also written, this means tolerance first, and tolerance may turn also in solidarity. Bolivarian anthropologist Silvia Rivera Cosicanqui has introduced for this the image of the Cheche, which comes from Aymara, and Cheche means a kind of juxtaposition of two different colors, white and black, which is seen from far away as gray, but if you come nearer, you see black and white dots. So it's display of difference and sociality, the common which is created. In this sense, we would highlight the importance of intermediate zones, contact zones, spaces of entanglement, and in a certain way, probably a little bit similar to Frederick Turner, we see these zones or frontier zones probably as the central zones of knowledge production and not of peripheral areas. Here I would like to come to another point, because until now we spoke basically about knowledge production and the importance of interhuman contacts. Nevertheless, we think that in the era of the Anthropocene, which we have discussed in the first session of these meetings, it is also to take into account non-human beings. In this sense, I think it's quite interesting, this term addressed by artists and also by Donna Haraway of Earthlings, to address all beings on Earth as probably part of the realm of the co-presence on Earth. And in this sense, we can see that basically the modern classification and division of the natural and the social is a divide that has been or a bridge that has been this has to be overcome in a certain way. Because actually what Marshall Sahlins told us, this what is obvious to almost to us is not obvious to many other cultures. And even in our own cultural tradition, if you think of Aristotle's cosmos, there are other ideas of co-presence, which we also see in recent indigenous debates on summa causae and the living together and mutual living. In the same way, Donna Haraway also called for new thinking of kinship networks, including non-human beings, and to cope the contemporary planetary crisis with new forms of symbiosis and sympoiesis. I think it sounds, what does it mean in very practical terms? I think here I like this project of Bruno Latour very much. You know, probably this theater play where all, so to say, representative actions form part of a new assembly, including water, the forest, endangered species, and so on. A model that we recently find also in law, when nature itself or a river can be the subject of legal processes. And to conclude, I want to give some points. What does this mean for knowledge production in institutions of knowledge production? First, I think we have to reconsider the idea of the academic subject itself and the processes of academic subjectification, which has to do that well, we try to, obviously from 19th century tradition, we try, researchers think of themselves in many ways as innovative genies, this idea, or on the other hand, they are reinforced to do so by the systems of self-optimization in academia, the quotation system, the promotion system, the quotes, and all these elements of academic entrepreneurship. Instead, probably we have to take more into account also academic conviviality and the co-production of knowledge, first with other academics, and second also with a lot of persons and beings out of academia. Second, I think probably in academic disciplines, it's probably more important not only to think about what is new, what has to be produced, but more about the how. How do we produce knowledge? And I think this goes far beyond academic disciplines. Probably it includes new ethics of academic research that have very much to do with these ideas of care and co-responsibility. A third point would be a plea for crossing boundaries of the academic disciplines and fields. We spoke about that. And I think so there are several disciplines, academic disciplines towards other systems of knowledge production. And I think one important aspect, also pointed out by Sarah, is that research questions cannot only surge or arise from the disciplines or even from single academic careers as innovative research, but probably they have to search more from interdisciplinary problematic situations and in dialogue with affected communities which name academic problems. And fourth, I think we talk about that is a decolonization of the academic field in a way that we acknowledge and foster and care for the ecology of systems of knowledge production, because there are so many systems of knowledge production, and obviously there has been a hegemony and a very strong effort of Western knowledge systems to wipe out and to suppress these systems. And I think we have here a certain historical duty to correct these forms in a certain way. And in this sense, I feel that projects like the Merian centers and the Käthe Hamburger colleagues and the area studies projects serve as kinds of bridges, connectors, and in a certain way also as contact zones. And in this sense, I would like to finish my short presentation here.
Thank you so much. Do you want first to relate to each other? Sarah, do you want to say something to Olaf, or Olaf direct? I mean, you already referred to Sarah. Or otherwise, I would open the floor for questions. And I see Werner Gephart already demuted himself.
No, just in case of. You would let me in. Excuse me. No. There will be a much more interesting question. First of all, if you allow, really my great respect for both of your talks. I'm very much impressed and even moved, though it is a very sophisticated semantics in which you were expressing yourself, referring to a long list of famous colleagues who have tried to go beyond the traditional limits, whether it's Randeria or Haraway, etc. I do agree a lot with you, and I think all points have an enormous impact. I think really to change and to bring more the new and novelties into the academic world. I do agree on many points. There was only one element that was missing to my understanding. And this is, from my experience and experiences in the Center for Advanced Study, Law as Culture, the role of the arts, and I'm not talking about my ethical practices that I'm doing, but great artists as Maria Eichhorn and others who worked with us, or Tim Shaw, a sculptor. They are so interesting for us because their way to ask questions is so different. They don't know Haraway necessarily, or are trained in the semantics of post-colonial thought, but they are very fundamental and very direct and more. If, for example, after a debate about legal cultures, there is a man coming to ask the question, yes, I really don't understand. So what in the end, Werner, please explain me, what do you understand by the law? Of course, this is a thing where I don't have an answer at hand, but I have to go very deep into my proper understanding of the legal world, the normative cosmos, etc. So I think this would be an element I would like to add to the long catalog that you have made, because I think it seems to be a luxury. It shouldn't be a decoration, but it can be a challenge. And as a challenge, it can be interesting. And a very short second remark, and this will be only 2 sentences, is I think the idea of a revolutionary approach should not be underestimated, because in general it is really a kind of substitution of categories that is necessary, a substitution of procedures, of methods. It is very fundamental, and it is not only the break of rules, and you must be free to break the rules, methodological rules. In sociology, it's les règles de la méthode sociologique. It's about rules and rule behavior. And so I think also this kind of spirit, and to have the freedom to do that, and to be for the young researchers and also the old ones, encouraged to do that, and in the midst of the realm of science. So 2 small parts. Thank you.
I would directly go to Martin Fuchs, or do you want to answer Sarah Corona, Olaf Kaltmeier?
I think you can get directly to Martin, and we answer the 2 just to enter better into the discussion.
Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for both the contributions, Sarah and Corona and Olaf. I'm completely with you in that respect. So, but I just want to somehow push it a little further and deepen the discussion. Just to raise 2 points, and other points one could raise later, regarding the confrontation of the colonializing powers and the other parts of the world. When many of the traditions which had been practiced before, when the traditions of thinking, of dialogue, of philosophy, but also the traditions which were implied in everyday knowledge of locals, have been destroyed or forgotten or broken, at least. Yeah, so it's very hard to revive them. You know, in certain regions like in India or in East Asia, you find many of them enshrined in texts, and there's a huge textual tradition. But the relation to that tradition is now interrupted. Yeah, that doesn't mean that everything has the same relevance today. But it's now we work about these traditions, yeah, but we don't work with these traditions. So that's something which is very hard to achieve. Yeah, it would be a long-term project, and I just have to think of a book of like the one of Jonathan Ganeri, who just revived the thinking of one Buddhist philosopher who thinks of consciousness, what we call consciousness, of the working of the mind, of attention in a very different way, but in dialogue with Western philosophies, which is very, very enlightening, but it's hard to follow. And very few of us have knowledge on both sides, Western philosophy and whatever of Indian philosophy. Then again, only one of the type of Indian philosophy, not the other types. And this we can continue. Then the knowledge of the local people who have their own, often not written traditions, is even harder to recover, and much of that is lost. Yeah, so that's the one point. The other is regarding the disciplines in which we are working. I mean, is something which we call social sciences today had not been around before the 19th century. But even to some extent, cultural studies have not been done in that same way. So we are using terminologies and applying them everywhere, which have been developed in a certain context. So when we then, in my case, in the Indian context, but it would be the same in South and Central American context, when we all come, no matter if we come from Western backgrounds or we come from the backgrounds of those countries, we apply those, we grow up with these concepts, yeah? And then we have to deconstruct them in a way. Take the term of religion. for someone who grew up in the tradition of Christianity and or other Abrahamic religions, the term religion makes much more sense than it made sense in the South Asian context or even East Asian context. Now the term religion has reached these countries, and many things have been redefined according to our terminologies of religion. I found it interesting, my fieldwork in Dharavi, in a big slum in Mumbai, that when they related to these questions, they use the term religion. They never use an Indian term for that. There are a range of Indian terms which overlap with our term religion, but in different, there's so many different ways, so there's not one direct translation. So how can we overcome the dominance of our terminologies? This is a very, very long-term project, if it is desired at all. Yeah? So these are just two comments to that. Yeah? But thank you. Yeah? That's, at AS we were basically pursuing the same agenda.
Please allow me to comment, to let follow my comment, because it's, I think, close to what Martin Fuchs said, and also, of course, quite different. I'm a historian for early modern history, and I have a special interest and expertise in the European perception and interaction with India in pre-colonial times. And I always think, if it's so post-colonial or about decolonizing, then it's always so clear how the power asymmetries are. And I think it's also interesting to look into times when the power asymmetries were not clearly in the European favor. And my feeling is that we, coming from pre-modern time, and maybe Alexandra Cuffel sees it similar, have similar problems, like if you come from different world areas. And of course, I don't want to make now this temporalizing that the pre-modern Europe is like other parts, but what I mean is we all have the problem with a very arrogant Western modernity. Yeah, and of course I don't have this political aspect. I don't need agency for my people in early modern times, but academically, yeah, I also have the problem that people from modern history come and say, you don't have a state, you don't have Wissenschaft, science. Yeah, and I think it would help very much to provincialize this modernity if we talk more with each other and see how different is it, and also the interaction or the perception, in my case, of pre-colonial India. This is not the religion in the same way. I don't say that they have a more correct way, yeah, but at least they don't talk about Hinduism, and that is quite interesting. And I think it could be inspiring for all of us to talk with each other. Also, people doing pre-modern European history without the global context. Yeah, still, I think they have problems with the Western modernity that could help us. I don't see any further questions, remarks, also not in the chat.
I think we have hard stuff to answer.
Yeah, then I give you all the last quarter of an hour to answer. Please.
¿Están traduciendo or is there a translation?
Sí, están traduciendo todo el tiempo, pero mejor que cambies el canal al español ahora.
Lo tengo en español. Well, yes, the questions are very complicated son muy difíciles de contestar en unos minutos y sin haber reflexionado mucho. Pero sí defendería yo la importancia de considerar siempre el conocimiento de los otros que no son de la academia, porque aunque se haya perdido, lo que se perdió fue el conocimiento antiguo. A mí lo que me interesa es el conocimiento que esas mismas personas lo actualizan el día de hoy. Porque el conocimiento de sus antepasados fue el conocimiento de sus antepasados. ¿Qué es lo que hoy ponen en práctica para resolver y enfrentar las crisis de nuestras modernidades? Y quiero poner un ejemplo, porque han hablado ustedes del concepto de historia. Estoy de acuerdo, el concepto de historia europeo es muy diferente al concepto de historia de los pueblos indígenas y de la gente en común también, ¿no? Pero el ejemplo iba sobre los indígenas Birraritari que viven en México, en el norte del estado donde estamos nosotros, y que ellos no tienen concepto para traducir historia, no existe eso. Lo que ellos tienen es un concepto que se llama yeyari, que quiere decir el trayecto de un punto importante a otro. Y la diferencia es, como ellos no escriben, es una lengua no escrita, entonces las huellas quedan en el cuerpo. Es una historia que se graba en el cuerpo. ¿Para qué, además de poético, para qué otra cosa puede servir? Lo que nosotros estamos haciendo es una historia de la fotografía y de la tecnología fotográfica y cómo transforma la mirada. El concepto yeyari nos ayuda mucho más para entender cómo la mirada en los últimos 25 años, desde que aparecieron y hasta que aparecieron los...
Until we saw the appearance of cell phones with cameras. How this has transformed us. This enables us to come up with a more complete history of both technology and the gaze. So this is the cultural issue. So I would say that. And definitively art, well, yes. As Olaf said, it's not only about the how, but we need to look at the method, the research method, and we believe that all different methods and the artistic method are, of course, valuable. These are where we need to really look at this more in depth. That's a true challenge. And this will help us to come up with new knowledge.
Yeah, maybe I can go on with this point. I think even in the architecture of our universities, the separation of the different disciplines is revealed, and our attempt was to create at least at the symbolic level, to revive this idea of the laboratory and open research in a certain way. And this also means that in our big collaborative format, so we established not only individual fellowships, but overall dialogical or collaborative research formats. And our biggest one is that of the Laboratory of Knowledge. And in that, we included the production of a documentary film. Not only in the same way as you have said, not only as a representation of the questions of the Anthropocene, but as another form of artistic knowledge production about the same topic. And we're still in it. We have recently the call open for this documentary film, but we're very keen to see the dialogues with the film production team in the end, and this mutual knowledge production. So I really think this is very important. And as I've said, therefore I really like this theater work of Latour, because it can bring in some dimensions and imaginations that may be very inspiring for us as social scientists or cultural studies scholars. In this sense, yes, I would also argue this idea of the revolution of knowledge probably is necessary in a certain way, but in a certain way also as a kind of permanent revolution, probably more in the sense of Paul Feyerabend's anarchistic models of knowledge production in a certain way, which very creative forms and arguing for a multiplicity of methods, depending on on the topics we're working with and not of academic disciplines. And I really find this also very inspiring for history, working with DNA analysis of soils and other possibilities that biology gives to can enter in dialogue with us. To Martin's commentary, I agree, and also what Sarah has said. But I think our idea is, or the idea of decolonization is not so much only that of revival. I think first it's important for our understanding of history to bring back this perspective, and also for the collective narratives and construction of communities to bring in a long history, a long durée with ruptures, obviously, and in this sense, I think it's important this research. And in a second way, I think we can't bring back what was destroyed. So the knowledge of, for example, knowledge production in textiles. There was so much transportation also and communication of knowledge in textiles, and we can't bring this back with all the scholars, so to say, that disappeared in colonial times from the communities. But I think it's important to use this concept of history from Aymara indigenous peoples, which argues a little bit similar to Walter Benjamin, that you have to look back to see the future. And if you look back, you have to know what was in the back, and you have to get knowledge about that. And if you see how, as you see, can see clearer the history, you can better see also the future, and which lies in a certain way in the back. And I think this is approach very important to several, at least indigenous and Afro-American and peasant communities in Latin America. But I also agree that we don't have so to say a strict difference, so to say, coloniality and modernity are intertwined. So where is modernity, there has been coloniality, and there has been an entanglement. And we know that obviously that also in processes, we have this antagonistic form, that in processes of decolonization, that they have been promoted by also elements of modern thought. If I think of the 1940s in Latin America and the adaptation of Marxism through José Carlos Mariátegui and diverse social movements like in Ecuador, La Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios, a communist peasant organization, but with journals in Quechua and so on. So I think that also in this intertwining, in this entanglement, are possibilities for decolonization. And now I'm lost a little bit in the questions, because in the end I think it's not only about naming, because obviously we have to change our concepts, and I agree with you that it's very challenging. I'm reading this book of Sibylla Rivera Cusicanqui, and there are more than 100 concepts from the Andean world, from Aymara. I don't speak Aymara, a little bit Quechua, a little bit, but that's very difficult and challenging. And if you take into account the multiplicity of indigenous people in Latin America and the different concepts from Mapuche, Guarani, and so on, it's very complicated, probably impossible, because in the end, multiplicity of concepts will interrupt the possibility of dialogue. So I think it's really a very challenging question, and I think therefore we put very much more emphasis in these forms of interaction and knowledge production in concrete constellations than an abstract process of naming, so to say, which is also important. Yeah, to Antje's question, yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I like, I agree that there are certain common processes. So thinking of the lost knowledge of the Anthropocene, we know that this, so to say, this war or this battle against the wise women in Europe, and the knowledge, ecological and environmental knowledge they had, is very similar to the erasure of, so to say, shamanistic and other religious authorities of indigenous society. They had a similar knowledge, and in this sense, it's quite interesting to see elements. And I think also in Latin America, at least, that especially in regard to the colonial period, post-colonial studies, or inspired critical colonial studies in this sense, have been very innovative, probably more innovative than in regard to the modern period. But just to end, I think it's very interesting if we can link these aspects. So in this sense, I really find it very inspiring to read Redica and Linnebo, because they linked this process of a colonial takeover and the fight against indigenous lands and so on, and with the Enclosure Act and the pressure against communal lands in England, obviously in the 18th century. So I think that probably in this sense more histories can be written in a more entangled way. Obviously, just to, and one work is also from Serge Gruzinski about colonial period, who's linking the experience of early of colonial Spain and the histories of the Philippines and Mexico in a very inspiring way. So probably these connecting histories in a certain way still there's still a lot to be done.
Thank you so much. It's 1917, so in German I would say we did a Punktlandung. I'm not sure how to say that in English. So we are on time. And I must say, for your concluding remarks, I really liked that you always said it's a true challenge. It's very challenging, because I think that also means that we are dealing with real important problems here. And on problems, we really need an expertise from the social science, from the humanities, that are really needed in our globalized world. And we are not just doing kindergarten. So in many ways, I really like it if we say it's challenging. Yeah, and from my side, thank you again to all channels. And it was really a great pleasure to moderate this afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Antje.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure, and please let us keep in touch.
Yeah.
It would be a pleasure for me. The reading list, you might send it to me if one of your co-workers will have the time in 6 months or so to send it to me. I would be very grateful for it. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add also, I probably